Hey everybody, I figure we're far enough away, like thousands and thousands of miles, we don't need masks. Well, I was thinking about going out and practicing my breakdancing for the 2024 Olympics, but I thought I'd probably do less dancing and more breaking of bones and things. I don't think I'm going to do that, but the rest of you can do that to get ready for the 2024 Olympics. We're going to talk about events in the Olympics that have been added and the next few Olympics, and in particular, let's hope we can get Brisbane to have the 2032 Olympics. That would be really cool. So we're going to talk in general about understanding how sports like sport climbing and breakdancing were added to the Olympics, and could esports be next? Now, Anthony Bedford suggested looking into esports, so I'm going to make that part of the talk. All right, what does it take for a sport to be IOC recognized? First of all, how much sweating and bleeding are required to be an IOC recognized sport? None, because when the IOC recognizes an international federation, it immediately, by definition, becomes a sports federation. Any competition organized by one of those sports federations is, by definition, a sport. There's 72 recognized sports, compared to 52 in the Olympics, 39 in the summer, and 15 in the Winter Olympics. And among these, by definition, sports are chess and bridge. Well, we'll talk about that in a minute. Any recognized sport can be added to the Olympics. The rules have changed for adding them, but any recognized sport is eligible. For example, of the 72 recognized sports that are Olympic eligible, there are the two mind sports, chess and bridge. Now, I don't expect to see them in the Olympics, but there are 6 aeronautical sports, including hang gliding and skydiving. I don't expect any of them to land in the Olympic Stadium. There are 8 land-powered sports, including Formula One. I don't think Lewis Hamilton will be a gold medal winner, power boating, and motorcycle racing. But there's 4 roller sports, including roller derby and incline roller hockey. They could make it. Imagine frisbee sports like frisbee golf and guts frisbee. That'd be cool. Free climbing sports. Actually, there will be one of those in the Olympics. 4 billiard sports and pool. 4 outdoor bowls, including bocce and lawn bowls. 2 recreational court sports, racquetball and squash. 2 fun recreational sports, bowling and dance sport, and there will be a dance sport in the Olympics. That's what breakdancing comes from. 2 water recreational sports, surfing, which is going to be in the Olympics, and water skiing. 3 international sports, including cricket, lacrosse, and highline. 3 breath-holding sports, including underwater hockey and underwater rugby. And cheer sport, sometimes called cheerleading. For example, in cheer sport, they do these amazing acrobatic movements and amazing skills of strength and balance that are eligible. Frisbee golf, there's the drive down in Frisbee, and there's putting. You hit the chain and it drops into the basket for a putt. How about underwater hockey? Breathing is really not a good idea. What you do is you flick a puck along the bottom of the pool. And as you can imagine, there aren't a heck of a lot of spectators there. Here's underwater rugby. Isn't that cool? You imagine that in the Olympics? Okay, this is not underwater rugby. I don't know who these guys are. I hope they didn't drown taking the picture. That is underwater rugby. You try to push a ball into a basket. And like in regular rugby, you try to hold the guy up so he can't score. So that's a commonality between the 2 sports. All right. How do they get into the Olympics as a medal sport? Through 1992, demonstration sports were offered that were not medal events. But if they were successful, they could become Olympic medal sports. It was kind of a trial system. But demonstration sports ended in 1992 because the Olympics had become too full to continue them. Some of the former demonstration sports became Olympic sports through the year 2000. Beginning in 2002, the IOC decided, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to freeze the number of sports federations at 28 and vote on them every 4 years. If we drop one, then a new federation can add sports. Well, that turned out to be a bit cumbersome, but let's look at what happened from 1948 through 2000. Polo and team handball were dropped. The dark lettered sports were added but weren't demonstration sports first. Judo and volleyball were added. Judo was dropped for one Olympics and added back. Archery was added, table tennis, softball, and triathlon. They did a good job of adding sports that had a lot of interest. Now, the ones in red had been demonstration sports. Handball went from being a regular sport to a demonstration sport, back to a regular Olympic sport. And it did happen to migrate from outdoor handball, team handball, to indoor team handball. Anyway, it was reinstated as a continuing sport. Tennis was added, badminton, baseball, women's judo, and taekwondo. So there were quite a good group that were added either as having been demonstration sports or just adding directly. The ones in dark here were demonstration sports, were just for fun and did not wind up in the Olympics. Lacrosse and Swedish gymnastics in London, Finnish handball in Helsinki, Australian rules football in Melbourne, Budo, no, I didn't spell judo wrong. Budo is a generic name for martial arts. That was in Tokyo. Pelota Vasca, basically high line, was in Mexico City. Water skiing in Munich. Bowling in Seoul. Pelota Vasca again high line in Barcelona. You can see the strong Hispanic interest in Pelota Vasca, means basketball, and in roller hockey. Okay, so by the year 2000, we had stopped having demonstration sports in 92, added Taekwondo to the Olympics, and then beginning in 2004, sports were added and dropped by vote. They decided to drop the sports federations handling baseball and softball, dropping both of those, adding golf and rugby sevens. Frankly, dropping softball was a major error. Baseball refused, Major League Baseball that is, to have their best players play, and they refused to cooperate in world championships, whereas basketball did cooperate. So I understand why they dropped baseball, but softball was then a separate federation and did nothing wrong. Everything had been done to add women's sports whenever there was a man's sport. It made no sense because you drop a man's sport, you drop a woman's sport, but they did. Okay, well, we had this rather cumbersome system going, and if it isn't broken, break it. They found a way to break it. Now, here's what happened. I believe that there was an interest to have T20 cricket in the 2020 Olympics. They called it T20 in 2020. But to do that, it was necessary to drop something. So the first thing they tried to drop was modern pentathlon, which Baron de Coubertin invented. It's the only sport invented directly for the Olympics. The Baron's descendants pled with them not to drop that sport. They didn't. They decided not to. Because they really wanted to get T20 in 2020, they had to drop something. Horrible idea, drop wrestling. Wrestling had been in the ancient Olympics. Big oops. They were totally embarrassed, so they immediately turned around and voted wrestling back in the Olympics, meaning there would be no change for the year 2020. Out of complete embarrassment, they decided to stop freezing sports federations. And in 2014, they adopted Olympic Agenda 2020, which made it very flexible to add sports just for one Olympics. Now, I might mention something about the modern pentathlon. There had been an ancient pentathlon, which were skills that ancient athletes needed to be warriors. Baron de Coubertin said, okay, let's imagine a courier in Napoleon's time taking a message to the enemy. That's what the modern decathlon was. First, he said, they would have to ride a horse and go over hurdles. So, okay, horseback riding and going over hurdles was added. They might have to fence with an enemy. Therefore, épée, fencing was added. They might have to shoot it out with the enemy. Therefore, rapid fire pistol shooting was added. Might have to swim across a river. 300-meter swimming was added. And they have to run and give the courier, give the results to a courier. And they added 3,000 meters running. Who would train for that weird combination of events? Who would do that? Me. I trained for a year and a half for the 1968 Olympics. I was fairly good at most of those, so the organizers asked me to come to the training center and train for 2 months before the Olympics. Unfortunately, I could not get the time off of work. And if I quit my job, I would lose a scholarship to get a PhD. Actually, I think they wanted me there for 2 months so I wouldn't get killed doing the jumping part. I'd have ridden a lot, but I'd never jumped. And they're probably right. Well, didn't want to give up my job and a scholarship to a PhD, so 2 good things happened. I did not get killed jumping over hurdles, and I did get a PhD. Now, as far as how I would have done in the Olympics, there's one thing you need to understand. The older we get, the better we were. I was darn good. Okay, so what was Olympic Agenda 2020? It was for adding sports temporarily. The idea was that starting in 2020, there would be a limit of 10,500 athletes. The first version of it for Tokyo 2020, they could ask to include any recognized sports as long as there were no more than 500 additional athletes. Now that would only be for 2020. For 2024 and 2028, the IOC said, okay, new rules, you must adhere to 10,500 athlete limit. The number of athletes in the continuing sports has to be reduced by the number you add to these temporary new sports. So here's what happened. For Tokyo 2020, the organizers decided to add surfing, skateboarding, sport climbing, karate, and baseball and softball, totaling 474. I think that's a great selection of really interesting sports. And so if we ever have the Olympics, the target was 10,500 athletes plus the 474. I have no idea what's going to happen next year. Paris, tougher deal. Paris has got to include any athletes they added. So they got more conservative. Added surfing, skateboarding, and sport climbing, good idea. Those are good choices. But they did not add karate and baseball, softball, because I didn't think they wanted to drop that many athletes from the continuing sports. But they did add breakdancing. There'll be 32 breakdancers. Now, I figure the organizers for France can go down into the Paris metro and find their team, as well as the London's underground and so on. And probably they'll be medal winners. The end result was 248 athletes in the new sports just for Paris. They need to drop that many from the 10,500, and they have to do that in December. So in a few months, that will happen. All right, there's room for 248. Add it. Now let's talk about, before we talk about the next Olympics in LA, about adding esports. The first 6 world championships use 10 esports as selected by the International Esports Federation. 9 of those are combat sports where you kill somebody. 1 is a simulation sport, FIFA Online. Perfect, because FIFA, that sponsors the game, also organizes competition in soccer. The other 9 are killing people. 1 of them is a simulation of soccer. That became hugely important when Thomas Bach spoke out. Bach said he could not find any organization, including International Esports Federation, that would exert long-term control over games and competitors because they were too busy marketing games. And they were too violent, the ones that were combat sports. However, he said, an e-sport that simulates a recognized sport would be okay. The IOC would deal with a recognized sports federation. Well, there are recognized federations that have e-sports. They just haven't been much in the World Championships, auto racing, motorcycle racing, boat racing, and in general Olympic sports, but in particular, e-soccer is already there. So by far the best choice would be the various FIFA e-soccer games. Those are the ones I think should be chosen. For example, when Major League Soccer in the US stopped, there was an e-soccer competition using the FIFA game, FIFA 20. It was hugely realistic. You see the game and then you see the two competitors that are manipulating the players. And then you have cool things like a backflip by the players. It's just like you're watching a real game. I think the FIFA 20 games would be perfect, 20 meaning 2020. So what about LA 2028? Well, let me talk about that for just a moment. Since the first bid came out, I live in the Los Angeles area, the first bid book came out, I looked at it, two things were obvious. The writers had no idea about Olympic Agenda 2020. They thought, well, sport had to be voted back into the Olympics. Secondly, the events were too clustered in the downtown area. I wrote a lengthy email saying where the events could be moved to, and I explained how Olympic Agenda 2020 worked. The organizing committee had me on a telephone call, conference call with the chief architect, and we went over all my suggestions and how Olympic Agenda 2020 works. In the next bid book, about 8 months later, they included virtually everything I suggested with the chief architect. And then about 8 months ago, I wrote the chief architect and said, you've got a dangerous situation with canoe and kayak and rowing inland in a hugely hot area, subject to fires. 4 days later, the organizing committee said they're changing and moving it right to where I said it should be, where the 1932 Olympics were, in the LA area. So I have their ear. Now let me show you what I suggested to them. What I did was I said, all right, you're going to inherit room for 248 athletes from Paris. I suggest continuing surfing, skateboarding, and sport climbing, really popular sports. Instead of breakdancing, use those 32 positions. The obvious choice is stand-up paddleboarding. Well, but you could be groundbreaking, you could be innovative, you could be the first of a kind to include e-soccer. And in my letter, I explained everything I did just to you about how Olympic Agenda 2020 works and all the reasons to have e-soccer. I did more than that. I said, all right, if each player is a team, you can have 16 men's teams and 16 women's teams. I then did more than that. I explained how to set up the soccer competition, e-soccer. I gave them session by session, how many games they have in a session, how long the session should be, given the length of e-soccer games, how many days to use, having days off. So that way, if they say, hey, e-soccer is a good idea, but we have no idea how to set up a competition, I've done that. I did one more thing. I said, there's going to be a lot of pressure on you to have baseball and softball. You'll need to drop 234 players from the existing continuing sports. But look at it this way. Paris dropped 248, you dropped 234. If they did it, you can do it. I think there's a really good chance baseball and softball will be at the LA Olympics. I don't know how aggressive and innovative they want to be, whether they would go with stand-up paddleboarding or e-soccer. But I'm going to send them another copy of the email. As they get closer to the selection date, I think it comes up in another year. And I think there's a chance they would do it, but it would take, a lot of nerve on their part, innovation on their part. So altogether, LA would go with the same 248 that Paris did or add 234 more. I think they will. I think they'll go it and have baseball and softball, largely, hugely popular American sports. So I think that's what's going to happen. Surfing, skateboarding, sport climbing, baseball and softball, and maybe e-soccer. I can live with paddleboarding. I enjoy watching it. I enjoy watching work by the hour, actually. Now, my paper ended here, but not our discussion, because I think Brisbane has a good chance at the 2032 Olympics. Jakarta and Brisbane are the two main competitors. The Koreas aren't reliable. I can't imagine. The whole thing could blow up. I'm sorry, blow up is a bad term. Disagreements could happen, and I really can't imagine them being trusted. Delhi is dropping out, and several European cities had thought about it, but generally the citizens have voted against it. Brisbane has a much better bid. So I started with what I thought LA might do, and I wrote a long letter to the Australian Olympic Committee, telling them everything I just told you about Olympic Agenda 2020 and this information. I suggested have it sticking with 48 surfers. Instead of 96 here for skateboarding, I said have 12 member teams of netball. Have netball in the Olympics. It would be hugely popular in Queensland and all over Australia. For the other 72, I thought, well, all right, choose either sport climbing or skateboarding. I don't think you have room for both. But I said, I have another idea. Assign 240 positions for 8 teams of 15 each in men's T20 and 8 teams of 15 players each in women's T20 cricket. And again, I said, T20 is hugely popular in Australia. It would make bidding on the Olympics hugely popular. And it wouldn't be that hard for you to, even if you have to, you might need to add that many, drop that many from the 10,500. Or if LA 28 has 482 positions, you don't have to do anything. You have plenty of room. So this is what I suggested for the Australian Olympic program. I really like the idea of having netball and T20 cricket. When I mailed it, after I sent it, I heard back from the, right away, from the Australian Olympic Committee saying they liked the idea, thanked me for the thoroughness of my suggestions. They would send it to their committee. And unfortunately, because of COVID, sports just stopped and their efforts for the Olympics stopped. But everything's coming back again in Australia, so I'm going to resend this letter, and I'm going to add one more piece of information. Because of COVID, Suncorp Super Netball is entirely in Queensland, in what you might call a bubble. So for that reason, this is a good time to make it clear that you would like to have netball in the Olympics, because Australia and Queensland and Australia in general would support your bid. So that's what I'm hoping happens. I think that would be so cool to have, well, I think it would be cool to have it in Brisbane anyway, but it would be so cool to have netball and T20 in the Olympics. Here is virtual people at a virtual competition of a virtual esport. And here we are in a virtual session talking about the Olympics. So if any of you have ways of contacting Australian Olympic authorities, and you can, say, you guys really should bid on the Olympics. And if you have any knowledge or friends that you could forward netball and T20, that would be awesome to have it in the Olympics. Meanwhile, all the best to all of you. Go practice your breakdancing. All the best to all of you. And next time we meet, let's make it right together, and I'll get the first round.